a major political thinker who challenged what he called congressional supremacy was actually Woodrow Wilson when he was a political scientist at Princeton. Wrote a very celebrated book. He wrote in the period when there had been no strong presidents, in the 1880s and the 1890s. And he ushered in the idea of what we now call the imperial presidency. Conservatism, classical conservatism, as I think of it, which came to fruition in America in the mid-20th century, actually also favored strong congressional leadership for the reason that Republicans and conservatives couldn't get presidents elected. We sometimes forget that for 5 consecutive elections from 1932 to 1948, Democrats won every single time. And Ronald Reagan voted for every one of those Democratic presidents. There was FDR 4 times, and Harry Truman after him. And so conservatives saw that Congress might actually become the source of strength for a conservative movement, partly because to some extent it already had been. The most powerful conservative in American politics from 1938 until 1950, really, with the emergence of Joseph McCarthy, was Robert Taft. Robert Taft, the old guard Republican from Ohio, the favorite of what we would think of now as ideological conservatives, who at that time were centered in the heartland, in the Midwest, and now have shifted to the South and the Southwest. That was the basis of American conservatism. It was isolationist, opposed entry into World War II, opposed all of Franklin Roosevelt's programs, all the New Deal programs, although Taft every now and again, who was actually kind of a brilliant figure, would bow and bend. He subsidized housing, for instance, for low-income workers he supported. He finally came around grudgingly on the first Cold War initiatives. That is the foreign policy initiatives. NATO, the Marshall Plan, which he opposed, but finally agreed to. Taft's idea of what the opposition party should do was very clearly spelled out. He said, our job is to oppose. We're the opposition party. We oppose. It is not our doing to suggest any alternative program or policy. This is the position we've reached today after what I think was the peak and height of conservatism in America, which came in the narrative I've written, The Death of Conservatism, from the 1950s to the 1970s. The great figures of mentions of Buckley and Chambers were essentially pragmatists who understood that a kind of social, cultural, and economic revolution had already occurred in America via the New Deal, and the job of conservatives was to moderate those impulses. That's why in my book I say the 2 great modern conservative presidents were Dwight Eisenhower and Bill Clinton. Eisenhower, because having followed these 5 successive quite liberal presidencies, realized that the programs they put in place had been accepted by the American public. And conservatives, according to the classical definitions of the term, really originate with Edmund Burke and then were carried out by Burke in 1790. And Benjamin Disraeli is the first great conservative statesman in England in the late 19th century, about 100 years later, 75 to 100 years later, saw that the role of conservatives was actually this will sound remarkable today, was actually to hold back the revolutionary tides created by capitalism, because capitalism is what disrupted the organic harmony in the culture. So Disraeli was the conservative who wanted to have public schools for the poor, provide them with medical care and all the rest. Those were not in the old definitions of the terms left and right and liberal and conservative. Those were not liberal ideas. Those were conservative ideas. Eisenhower taking office in 1953 and being pressured from the right in his own party to repeal or roll back the New Deal, refused to do it. Because he saw the public now accepted Social Security, for instance. What president in his right mind would undo Social Security when the country now looked to it for support? Bill Clinton was a conservative peering at our politics through the looking glass. He followed three Republican presidents, three presidencies, Ronald Reagan in 80 and 84, and George H.W. Bush in 1988. Clinton was elected in 1992 as a kind of John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson, New Frontier, Great Society liberal. And I don't know how many of you remember these facts, so I'll offer them to you. Some of you are probably too young to have been aware of them. Clinton actually won as decisive a victory in 1992 as Barack Obama did in 2008. The difference was there was a third-party candidate, H. Ross Perot, who got 19% of the vote. If Bill Clinton had gotten 9% of that 19, he would have had the same total of votes as Obama did, the same percentage. Even without that, he won more electoral votes than Obama did in 2008. Clinton is actually the beginning of what should have been a Democratic hegemony in modern politics. More important than the size of Clinton's victory was the size of George H.W. Bush's defeat. He won 38% of the vote. That's less than Herbert Hoover won in 1932. So this was, by any normal measure, whole-scale repudiation of the Republican politics we'd seen. Clinton, charismatic politician, younger than Barack Obama when he took office. Very good speaker, not as good a writer or orator as Barack Obama, but I think we've all learned, somewhat better at retail politics. Decided very early on, because the economy was in trouble, that he would propose a stimulus package. This shows you how times have changed. Barack Obama's stimulus package, of course, we know, was almost $800 billion. Bill Clinton's massive package was $19 billion. It was stopped 4 successive times by a Republican filibuster. Clinton actually had majorities in both houses roughly equivalent to Barack Obama's. He had 57 or 58 senators, and he had in the House roughly the same majority. In the book, I quote a distinguished commentator, public policy analyst, Alan Ehrenhold, who edits Governing Magazine, who says the filibuster of Clinton's stimulus plan began in February, carried through April 1993, was one of the great, although not good, revolutions in modern politics. The filibuster had been used before, principally by Southern segregationists who wanted to stop civil rights legislation, until the most brilliant legislator of them all, Lyndon Johnson, found a way around it. It had not ever been used to stop an incoming president from presenting his legislative agenda. It had not happened. And that was the event that ultimately led to the contract with America and the rise of Newt Gingrich, the impeachment of Clinton, and also the flood of lobbyists into Washington under Gingrich, Tom DeLay, Dick Armey, whom we're hearing about again, and those other Republicans. What I've been thinking about recently is how this structural change in the way Congress operates is probably the most important development in our modern politics. Remember, we are now accustomed to a president, Barack Obama in this case, who presents legislation to Congress. If he can't secure every single vote on his side in both chambers, and if there are enough opposition votes in the Senate to threaten a filibuster, that legislation will not go through. This has become a regular part of how our politics works. This has become built into the system. That is why the loss of a single seat in Massachusetts seemed to have cataclysmic implications for our politics. This was a special election, right, for 2 years, in which a fairly moderate Republican won, yet that is enough of a transformation to actually bring our policymaking to a halt at a time when we're in an economic emergency that is the worst since the Great Depression. That's what's happened to our politics. And I want to explain how I think that happened, because it tells you something about how the conservative movement worked. One of the great revolutions that occurred within the conservative movement is one very similar to what we're seeing today. It occurred within the Republican Party. Great insurgencies in our politics occur within individual parties. If you look at the Democratic Party and the rise of the New Left in the late 1960s with Eugene McCarthy's challenge to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, who in 1964 won one of the 2 or 3 biggest landslides in American history, by 1968 saw he could not even seek re-election because he'd been challenged in a single primary in New Hampshire by voters, many of them students, who had crossed the line from Massachusetts, from colleges there, to vote in the primary, many of whom in polls did not even know that Eugene McCarthy opposed the war in Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson was prosecuting it. This led, by the way, to something quoted in my book, one of the great coming-of-age moments of modern conservatism. It was a brilliant column written by William F. Buckley. Here was a moment, April 1968, when conservatives should have rejoiced. Johnson was the most hated of all modern presidents to the right, the author of the Great Society. He'd spent more money. He'd started more programs. He'd left the civil rights movement, the de facto segregation, de jure segregation of the South. That conflict moved north, where it had become, the de facto conflict that led to urban unrest. There were campus riots as a result of that Vietnam War. The cities were burning, sometimes dozens of them in the space of a few weeks. And now the Republicans knew, because Johnson had not been defeated by Eugene McCarthy, but had been challenged strongly by him. I think the numbers were 47% to 42, something like that, New Hampshire. Johnson would not seek re-election. Inevitably, when there's a convulsion like that within one party, the other party wins. And William Buckley wrote a column that said, this actually isn't good news. He said, if these carloads of students who aren't even aware of the great political conflicts of the day can, in the choice, through the action of voting in a single primary, drive the duly elected president out of office, which in effect they've done. He said the great conservatives in our tradition, and he mentioned Edmund Burke and also John Adams in the United States, would not feel so easy about this, because this means that the structures of order, the established structures in the political system, are being threatened. And that is actually more important than which party wins the next election. And if there is a Republican or conservative today who would write anything remotely like that, I would like to know who he or she is, because I've not seen one. Now, what had happened was the Republicans had begun a purification process within their own party. This is useful history because we're seeing it repeated now. As late as 1964, the political scientist James McGregor Burns was pursuing a theory that he'd actually first written about 10 years before, that there were not 2 parties in America, but actually 4. There were 2 parties within the Democratic Party and 2 within the Republican, and he labeled them thus. Farthest left, he said, are the presidential Democrats. So these would be people like, or candidates. Adlai Stevenson was the first he saw, then John F. Kennedy, then it became Lyndon Johnson, although Johnson had been more conservative when he was in the Senate. He said, slightly to the right of that are presidential Republicans. And by that, he really meant Dwight Eisenhower, who had been this moderate figure. To the right of the presidential Republicans were the congressional Democrats. So you have to let that sink in. Democrats in Congress in the 1950s and 60s were more conservative as a group than a Republican president. We saw this again, by the way, when Richard Nixon was elected. Nixon, who I think, and many others have said this too, was actually the last liberal president in America. Anyone remember Ted Kennedy's regret when after he died, his reported regret was that he had not cut the deal on health care that Nixon had offered him, which was more liberal than the one the president has given us now. So to the right of the presidential Republican came the congressional Democrats, and farthest right, Burns said, and farther right than anybody else was left were the congressional Republicans, the heirs of Robert Taft, the ones who said, you govern, you don't govern, actually, you repudiate the idea of governance by simply opposing it from ever taking place. One of the changes that's happened, I'm sometimes asked when I first wrote this book about a year ago until today, is when I was writing it, the enemy on the right seemed to be big government. I don't think it is anymore. I think it's actually governance itself. The very idea that we would elect officials who are entrusted to write and pass the laws in our country. This is what the Sarah Palin movement, if that's what it is largely about, is resisting the very idea that there should be a governing class in America, that anybody is good enough to govern simply by virtue of who that person is. It's sort of a conservative form, a right-wing form of identity politics, something actually taken from the left. Because of these four different parties, our legislation went forward through a kind of endless negotiation. So Lyndon Johnson in the 60s could get a civil rights bill passed by corralling the right Republicans, or not rather the left Republicans. He could also get Medicare passed with 13 Republican votes. Because there were Republicans from the Northeast, the most powerful Republican for many years in the United States has been Thomas Dewey, a liberal Republican who'd been the governor, before that Attorney General here, the prosecutor in New York. And it was through that combination of forces that laws actually got written. When Republicans decided, or conservatives within the Republican Party decided that they wanted a more ideologically consistent party, they purged what were, you know the term now, Republicans in name only, right? The rhinos. In that period, they were called Me Too Republicans. They were assumed to be part of the political establishment who could not be trusted to carry through on the ideological principles that many conservatives subscribe to. And they managed this transformation, and Buckley was one of its leaders. I always want to be careful about Buckley because you see he actually was prismatic. Every side of conservatism was reflected in him. But he was the intellectual leader of the movement in 1964 that drafted Barry Goldwater for president. Goldwater lost that election, and Burns, writing about the Goldwater movement, saw exactly what it meant to do. He said they know they can't win an election. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. There was no chance any Republican could be elected. What they could do is gain control of the party itself. And they shifted its geographical axis from the Northeast and the Midwest to the South because they went after all the anti-civil rights voters there, the whites who would oppose civil rights, and the Southwest, which had a growing populations, and where there was particular hostility to government interference. That became the basis of the Republican Party we have now. That's why, if those of you who are following the Tea Party movement will see that the most intense struggles are taking place now in Colorado and Florida, because there are entrenched conservative groups there who are in essence duplicating what the Goldwaterites did in 1964, which is to force as many moderates out of the party as they could. And they did it in the same way, by campaigning for, during the nomination process, the most conservative candidates they could find. And this is what we're likely to see as we move toward 2010. The problem is, in 1964, President Bradamus could probably rattle them all off. You could identify the moderate or even liberal Republicans because most of them are from the Northeast. There is not a single Republican legislator in the entire Northeast in Congress, and there are two in the Senate. In the House, there are none. There are two in the Senate. They don't exist any longer. That's why the attacks are now being led against figures most of us would consider conservative already. Someone like Lindsey Graham from South Carolina is being attacked as having been complicitous in Obama's big government, in the perceived big government programs, when he's opposed every single one of them. So now what we'll see is a politics of a litmus test. I don't know if any of you have seen this. There was a proposed series of 10 principles presented to the Republican National Committee. Has anyone seen this? One of them was to oppose Obama's socialist agenda. Another was to restore states' rights to America. Now, what's interesting about this is a change in politics that's occurred actually since I wrote this last book, is the emphasis is not so much on social conservatism any longer. It's not about gay marriage so much. It's not the evangelicals who are in charge. It's really a demographic change, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we should probably get the panel up here, right? How are we for time? Okay. I just want to mention one interesting thing that some of you may know, some not. Does anyone know which demographic group actually voted for John McCain in the last election? There was one. It was the elderly. Yeah. There were two groups from the age of about 40 to 50. It was more or less even, but from 60 on up,